Good evening, guys. In the last session, we discussed about what is the folder structure for Spring Boot application. When we create the boot application, we can see src main Java. src main Java folder is used to keep our project source code. And by default, one Java class will be created in that folder that is called as our start class. Start class is used to run our boot application. We can also call it as start class is entry point for the boot application. And we will have the main resources. It is used to keep our project configuration files. Application.properties or application.yml files will be available in this folder. Any configuration files that you want to use in the project, we will keep in that resources folder. And for our source code, we will develop some unit test coding. Unit test coding we are going to write in the test Java folder. For that unit testing purpose, we need any configuration files we will keep in the test resources folder. And here Maven dependencies available. What are the dependencies that we have downloaded for our project? Those dependencies will go inside this folder. And a pom.xml, which is used for the Maven configuration. So any dependencies that we want to download in the project, those dependencies we are going to configure in the pom.xml. Then after we discussed about what is start class in the Spring Boot. Start class is called as entry point for boot application execution. So this is our Spring Boot start class. Start class will contain this annotation, which is @Spring Boot application annotation. That one annotation is equal to below 3 annotations. That one annotation is equal to below 3 annotations. All right. Now Spring Boot application annotation is available. So this annotation is equal to 3 annotations. And inside that class, we have a main method. In that main method, we are calling Spring application.run method. Run method is entry point for boot application. Now boot configuration means that class will be represented as a configuration class. Whatever the start class we are creating, that start class by default acting as a configuration class. To represent this class as a configuration class, you no need to write the configuration annotation because already that annotation is available. And we have auto configuration. So what are the settings that are required? Whatever the configuration that is required to run the boot application, that will be provided by this auto configuration. It is provided by auto configuration. How that auto configuration is coming to our project? See here, when we create that boot application, we got the Maven dependencies or Gradle dependencies are available. If you see the dependency, which is auto configurer.jar file. What is this auto configurer.jar file? This auto configurer.jar file contains several classes available, which are required for enabling auto configuration in the Spring. When we create the boot application, by default Spring Boot starter came into picture. In that Spring Boot starter, we are having one auto configurer jar file. If you go to that auto configurer jar file, lot of packages available. Those packages contains a lot of classes. And we can see meta-inf. Inside this meta-inf, meta-inf is one directory which is available inside auto configurer.jar file. So did I add this auto configurer jar or it came by default? Auto configurer jar came by default. If you expand project dependencies in the Gradle project, if you expand this dependency, so there are several packages. In the packages, there are several classes. If you go to meta-inf, spring.factories class available. If you open that spring.factories class, these are the initializers which are loading by default. These are the listeners which are loading by default. These are the processes which are loading by default. Import listeners, configuration filters, and failure analyzers, and availability providers, initializing the detectors, and database initialization detectors. So these are the classes which are provided by Spring Boot. These classes are going to provide the configuration which is required for our application. So what is auto configuration? Auto configuration is the facility. Auto configuration is a feature available in the Spring Boot, which will provide the configuration which is required for our application. Now, whatever the configuration that is required for the application, it will be identified by using this spring.factories file. Based on the dependencies we have added in the project, it will identify the configuration. So like that, start class is acting as a configuration class, and start class is acting as a auto configuration enabling class, and it is acting as a component scan also. Already we discussed what is component scan. Component scan is used to identify Spring beans. Component scan will be performed in the Spring Boot because of this annotation. So component scanning means it will identify the classes which are represented as a Spring Bean. When we go for the component scanning, by default, it will search in the current package. That will be considered as a base package. So as that is a base package, all the other packages which are starting with the base package also will be scanned. Now in this project, in.ashokit is available, in.ashokit.dav available, in.ashokit.service available, in.ashokit.util is also available. So the class, the package which contains the start class, that package will be considered as default base package. So it is going to scan the base package and it will scan the sub packages of the base package also, like DAO, service, and util. It is going to scan all these sub packages as well. So we understood what is that annotation. The next question is, what is this run method? The next question is, what is this run method? So now here main method is available in the start class. Whenever we run our program or whenever we run our project, it will execute from this start class. Start class is entry point for the boot application. In that start class also we have a main method. Inside the main method, we are calling Spring application.run method. So this is the entry point. Spring application is a predefined class. In that class, we have a static method called run method. Inside this run method, lot of logic is available. So what is the logic available in the run method? Yesterday, I have given one video. Did you guys gone through that video? Did you guys gone through that video? I have given one video to understand what is run method. How many people watched? Can you raise your hand in the Zoom? How many people watched that video? Yesterday, I posted one video in the group. How many people watched that video? Only 6 people, huh? Only 6 people watched that video, huh? What is this, guys? I told you that yesterday, that is important to understand internals of that method. I gave you that video, it is just 15 minutes. Don't you have 15 minutes time in the 24 hours? You need to feel it important. Yeah. So here we are having start class. Inside the start class, we are having a run method. So that run method is a predefined method. That run method internally calling another run method. That run method internally calling Spring application.run method. Spring application is a predefined class and run method is getting called. Now, first of all, see what is this Spring application. Spring application is a class. Spring application is a class and which is predefined. This is Spring application class having a constructor, Spring application.run method. Whenever we call this Spring application.run method, internally it is calling this method, guys. Let me show you how I am coming to this level. Spring application.run method, we are calling by passing 2 parameters. Go to that run method. I'm pressing the control and I'm clicking on the method name. Press control in the keyboard, click on the method name. So once I click on that, I'm coming inside the run method. This run method internally calling another run method. Okay, go inside that run method. That run method internally calling Spring application.run method with a Spring application constructor. So now we need to understand what this constructor is doing and what this run method is doing. Spring application constructor. Spring application is a predefined class. This class constructor is executing and run method is calling. First go to constructor. This constructor internally calling its own constructor chaining. Here it is passing resource loader and it is passing primary sources. So here primary sources created. 263 line number is very important. So what is that 263 line number? In 263 line number, it is identifying what type of application we have created by using Spring Boot. So there is one line of code, web application type dot deduce from class path. Web application type dot deduce from class path. If you go to this deduce from class path, this method is used to identify what type of application we have created. Are we creating just web application by using Spring Boot? Are you creating reactive application by using Spring Boot? Based on the dependencies we configured in the pom.xml, this Spring application class is identifying what type of a project we have created. Okay, Spring application is a predefined class. Spring application is a predefined class, and it will identify what type of application we have created based on dependencies added in pom.xml file. Okay, so whether you have created just a standalone project by using Spring Boot, or you have created web application by using Spring Boot, or you have created reactive application by using Spring Boot, it will identify based on the dependencies. Class utils is present. If you have reactive dispatcher handler, then it will consider that as a reactive application. If you create just servlet indicator classes, that is, then it will comes under, if it is not the servlet indicator class, then it is a normal application. Otherwise, it will consider that as a servlet based web application. So we can create three types of applications by using Spring Boot. One is standalone application. We can create standalone application, and we can create web application, and we can create reactive application. How it is going to identify? In the pom.xml, if we have just a Spring Boot starter, it will consider that as a standalone. If you have Spring Boot starter web dependency, if you have Spring Boot starter web, Spring Boot web starter, if you have web starter, it will consider that as a web application. Suppose if you add your application web flux starter, then it will consider that as a reactive application. So now if you go to our normal Spring Boot application, we are getting one dependency by default. That dependency is called as starter. Now you see Spring Boot starter is available. So if you have the Spring Boot starter, it is going to consider that application as a standalone application. If you make the starter as a web starter, it will consider that as a web application. If you add the starter as a web flux starter, it will consider that as a reactive application. So Spring application is a predefined class, and it will identify what type of application we have created based on dependencies added in the pom.xml. Okay, guys. Now, if we add this Spring Boot starter, then it will be considered as which application? That means it is standalone application. If we add Spring Boot starter, that means it is standalone application. If we add Spring Boot web starter, then it will consider that as a web application. I will tell you why it is understanding type of the application. If we add web flux starter, it will be considered as reactive application. Are you guys getting my point? So who is identifying the type of application? Our start class is identifying, our Spring application class is identifying. Who is identifying that information? Our Spring application class is identifying that information. Spring application class is identifying that information. As part of this run method, Spring application constructor is executing. In this constructor, it is identifying that logic. Okay, so now based on type of the application, based on type of our application, it will start IOC container. Are you getting my point? So earlier in the Spring framework, programmer is responsible to start the IOC container. But in the Spring Boot, programmer is responsible to start the IOC container, or start class is starting the IOC container. Guys, am I starting the IOC container? My start class is starting the IOC container. Please respond to my questions. Very, very important session. Programmer starting the IOC container. Spring Boot is starting the IOC container. Spring Boot is starting the IOC container. So here, based on the type of the application, IOC container will be changed. If you create a project with a normal web starter, then if you have a just starter, then it will consider that as a standalone application. Now see which class it is using to start the IOC container. If it is just a boot starter, context, I got the context. Spring application.run method is returning the configurable application context object. Let me get the name of the class, guys. System.out.println, which class it used to start the IOC container. Context.getClass.getName. Context.getClass.getName. I want to get the name of the class which is used to start the IOC container in our application. So earlier, we started the IOC container by using application context, new class path XML application context, annotation config application context, XML bin factory classes we have used to start the IOC. Now, I am starting the IOC container, or my boot application only starting the IOC container. I am starting the IOC container, or my boot application is starting the IOC container. I am starting the IOC container, my boot application is starting the IOC container starting by boot. Now, which class it is using to start the IOC container? Let's understand this. Right click, run as boot application. Okay, can you see the class name? Annotation config application context. Okay, guys. So when I have boot starter, which class it is using to start the IOC container? Annotation config application context it is using to start the IOC container. Are you guys clear with my point? Earlier, we started the IOC container manually. If you see our Spring Core example, when we develop our example by using normal Spring framework, what we have done? We have started the IOC container manually. Class path XML application context. Then later we used the annotations application. When we go for annotations application, we have started the IOC container on our own. We have started the IOC container on our own. But now we no need to do that because boot is going to take care of that. You see, I have started IOC container by using annotation config application context by giving the config class. But if you see the start class, I'm not doing anything. I'm just calling the run method. Spring application is starting that IOC container based on the class path. So in my project currently, just a normal boot starter is available. Boot starter is used to develop the standalone application. So when we are creating a boot application with the boot starter, then Spring Boot is using this class name to start the IOC container. Are you able to understand why this Spring application is identifying the type of the application? It is identifying the type of the application to identify which class it has to use to start the IOC container. If you add normal boot starter, it will be considered as a standalone application. It will use annotation config application context class to start IOC container. To start IOC container. For standalone app, it will use annotation config application context to start the IOC container. Are you guys getting my point? Guys, are you guys getting my point? So a lot of internals we need to understand to get more clarity on the Spring Boot. Okay. For example, I will change the starter. For example, I will change the starter to web starter, guys. I will change the starter to web starter. So when I change the starter to web starter, then what will happen? It will consider our application as a web application. When it will consider our application as a web application, which class it will use to start the IOC? Can we check that? If I change the starter from boot starter to web starter, Spring Boot starter web. Spring Boot starter web dependency I am adding. Spring Boot starter, Spring Boot web starter or starter web I am adding. When I add Spring Boot starter web, what will happen? When I add Spring Boot starter web, what will happen, guys? Now run our application, run as Spring Boot application, Spring Boot, maybe it is web starter, Spring Boot web starter or starter web, Spring Boot starter web. I think previous one only correct. Spring Boot starter web dependency I have added. What is this web starter? Starter web, it is used to develop the web application. Now guys, observe, whenever I add Spring Boot starter web dependency, what is the behavior of the boot application? When I add starter web dependency in the boot application, what is the behavior? Can you see Spring Boot starter web dependency I have added? Can you see here Tomcat server is coming by default? Tomcat embedded server is coming by default. Spring Boot starter Tomcat. So whenever you add the starter web, by default Tomcat server will be added to our project. By default, Tomcat server will be added to our project. Are you guys getting my point? Are you guys getting my point? Now run this application, run as the boot application. Now see which class it is using to start the IOC container. Which class it is using to start the IOC container. Now you check it. Tomcat server started on the port number 8080. So that means Tomcat server I am starting. Tomcat server started by Spring Boot. This is embedded server. So when we develop a application by using web starter, Spring Boot will understand that it is Spring Boot starter web. Spring Boot starter web. Spring Boot starter web flux. Spring Boot starter web flux. When you add the Spring Boot starter web, it will consider as a web application. For web application server is required. Spring Boot is intelligent to understand that for web application server is required and it started the server. By default, we will get the Tomcat as the embedded server with the port number 8080. Okay, now see which class it is using. Annotation config servlet web application context class. Okay, guys. Now for web application, it is using this class name to start the IOC container. Class to start IOC. So it is using same class to start the IOC for all applications. Based on the type of the application, it is changing that class. Come on, guys. Is it using same class for all the application types? For web apps, annotation config servlet web server application context class will be used to start IOC container. If it is a standalone application, it is using this class to start the IOC. If it is if there is a web starter in the build path, if you have web starter dependency, then it is calling annotation config servlet web server application context class to start the IOC container. What is the proof? I'm printing the context class name. IOC container is returned by the run method. So Spring application.run method is returning the application context, configurable application context. What is the name of that context? When I have just a normal starter, when I have just a Spring Boot starter, that's it. When I have just a Spring Boot starter, see the class name, run as boot application. When I have normal starter, it is giving this class name. When I am changing the starter type to web, the class name is changing. That means for based on the application type, it is changing the class to start the IOC. Port number 8080 already in use. Second time I have started my application. That's why it failed. Stop it. Now right click, run as boot application. As we have web starter in the pom.xml, it is starting the Tomcat server by default. It is embedded server. It is printing this class name. Now I have taken that class name. Are you guys able to understand this point? Spring application is a predefined class and it will identify what type of application we have created based on the dependencies added in the pom.xml. If we add boot starter standalone app, for standalone app, it will use this class name to start IOC container. If we add web starter, it will consider as a web application. For web applications, it will use this class to start the IOC container. Suppose if I add WebFlux, that is a reactive concept. To develop reactive applications, I'm using WebFlux dependency. So when I use WebFlux dependency, how the application is going to behave, what class it will use to start the IOC container, let's understand. I'm changing the starters, that's it. Right click, run as boot application. Right click, run as boot application. I have started this project. Now observe, guys, is it using a same class or is it using a different class? Guys, is it using same class or is it using different class? Is it using same class or is it using a different class? It is using different class. Annotation config reactive web server application context. Okay, guys, if we add boot starter WebFlux reactive application. Okay, for reactive applications, for reactive apps, it is using class. For reactive app, this class will be used to start IOC container. Are you guys getting my point? If we add WebFlux, then it will be considered as a reactive application. If you use just web starter, it will be web application. If you use WebFlux, it will be reactive application. For reactive application, annotation config reactive web server application context class will be used to start a IOC container. Are you guys able to follow this? So is it using same class for all the applications? No. If it is a starter, normal starter, this class to use IOC container. If it is web starter, this class is used to start IOC. If it is a WebFlux, it is using this class to start the IOC container. Based on the type of application, it will start IOC container. Okay. Our Spring Boot application will start IOC container based on our type of the application. Who is identifying type of the application? Type of the application will be identified by Spring application class. Type of the application will be identified by Spring application class, which is a predefined class. Are you guys able to understand my point? Are you guys able to understand my point? Now you may get a doubt. Sir, if I add both dependencies, for example, I'm adding I'm adding normal starter and I'm adding web starter and I'm adding WebFlux starter also. If I add all the dependencies, then what is going to happen? If I add all the dependencies, then what is going to happen? I have added boot starter. I have added boot starter web dependency. I have added boot starter WebFlux dependency. 3 dependencies I have added in the single project. Then which class it will use to start the IOC container? Let's observe. So we already discussed. If we add normal starter, this class will be used to start IOC. If we use a web starter, this class will be used to start IOC. If we add WebFlux starter, it will use this class to start the IOC. Okay, right click, run as boot application. Right click, run as boot application. Click on the console, see that which class it is using, annotation config servlet web server application context. That means if you add all the three, priority is giving to this class to start the IOC. Are you guys able to understand my point? If you add all the three starters, which one is getting the priorities to start the IOC? This class is getting the priority to start the IOC container. Are you getting? That is the logic that they have implemented. So that is the logic that they have implemented in the deduce from the class path. Okay. So based on these conditions, they are going to return servlet class. If three dependencies are available, then this class is getting the highest priority to start the IOC container. That is the logic which is available. Okay, guys. Perfect. Next one. So with this, we understood what this Spring application class is doing. Now let's get into the run method. Now I am removing this web starter and webflux starter. Currently, these are not required for us. When we go for web MVC, we will talk about them. Perfect. I have removed them. Now go to this run method. What is run method is returning context. That is the reference of the IOC container. Go inside the run method. This run method internally calling another run method. That run method internally calling this run method. Inside this run method, we have some logic. Inside that run method, we have some logic. All right. So what is the logic available inside this run method? Observe carefully. First, it is starting the timestamp. System.nanotime. That means when exactly this run method is called, it is tracking that time. System.nanotime long start time. It is calculating the time. Then it is creating the bootstrap context object, which is used to store the internal execution details of our boot application. Once this is done, it is getting all the listeners from the Spring factories. Whatever the listeners that are required for our application execution, those listeners it is getting. Those are called Spring application run listeners. Get run listeners it is calling. Then listeners dot starting. Whatever the listeners it has loaded, then it is calling listeners dot starting. Whatever the listeners are required for our application execution, these listeners, guys, we are not going to use them. Those are for internal purpose when the boot application is executing. We are not going to use them directly. So listeners, it is loading, and listeners, it is starting. Then it is preparing environment. Preparing the environment means whatever the properties that we are writing in the application.properties file or application.yml file, it is going to load those properties to understand environmental configuration. Once that environmental configuration part is completed, then it is calling print banner. What is the meaning of a print banner? Whatever the Spring logo that you are able to see on the console, that logo is called as Spring banner. That logo is called as Spring banner. Are you guys getting my point? So whenever we call this print banner method, whatever the Spring logo is available, that Spring logo will be printed on the console. If you want, you can disable that banner also. Now you can disable that banner in the properties file. Here you can specify spring.banner.mode. Spring.banner.mode. You can specify that banner for the Spring also. Spring.main.banner.mode. So here for the banner mode, if you set as a off, that means that banner will not be printed. So whenever we start our application, run method is calling. Inside the run method, this banner method is available, print banner. If a banner mode is off, if I'm setting the mode as off in my properties file, that banner will not be printed on the console. All right. I'm setting the banner mode is equal to off. When I set the banner mode is off and run as boot application, check this. Application is getting started. Application is getting started, but that logo is not printing. Why the logo is not printing? That logo is called as banner in the Spring Boot. That banner we can set as off. In the properties file, we can write that configuration. Spring.main.banner mode is equal to off. So if I remove this, then again, when you run your application, that banner will be printed. So printing the banner logic is also available in our boot class run method. Run method. Right click, run as boot application. So whenever we run this boot application, so here banner is printing again because I have removed that off mode from the properties file. Now, do you understand what is the purpose of this print banner method? Guys, now do you understand what is the purpose of a print banner method? Yes, correct. So banner is printing. After banner is printing, then it is creating application context. Creating application context means it is starting the IOC container. Creating application context means it is starting the IOC container. So how it is starting the IOC container? Based on the type of the application. As I told you, if boot starter, standalone. For standalone, it will use this class to start IOC. So here that logic is available to create application context. Creating application context means starting the IOC container. So IOC container will start by the programmer, or IOC container will start by start class in the Spring Boot run method. Run method is starting the IOC container in the Spring Boot. So once that IOC container started, it is going to set up that start and preparing the context by loading all the bootstrap, context, environment, listeners, arguments, everything will be given to the context and context will be ready. Then it will perform dependency injection, all that stuff. Then it is going to refresh the context. Then it is calculating the time. Here we observe start time is available. When this method is started, here we have end time. End time minus the start time, it will give you total time to execute the application. System.nano time, this is the start time, and this is end time. End time minus the start time, it will give you total time it took to execute our application. That total time it took to execute our application printing on the console. Are you guys getting my point? Now you see, whenever we run our application, it is printing one logo on the console. That logo is called as Spring Boot banner. And after that logo, it is printing some messages on the console. Started application in 2.38 seconds. How it will understand that it is 2.38 seconds to start that application? Here, they are calculating start time. System.nano time, it is start time. This is the logic and this is the duration. Okay, this is the end time. End time minus start time, the total time it has taken to execute our application. That time it is printing on the console. The time it took to execute our application printing on the console. After printing that timing, then here it is calling runners. So runners, what is a runner? We will discuss what is runner in the coming class. Runners are used to execute the code only one time when the boot application is executed. Suppose when my project is started, I want to load the data from the database. I want to store in the cache. Then I can go for runner. So what is a runner in the Spring Boot? Runners are used to execute your logic only one time when the project is started. So how many times this run method will be called? Guys, in the project, how many times this run method will be called? For every 5 seconds run method will be called, or only one time run method will be called? Only run method will be called only one time. So whenever the boot application is started, it will call the run method only one time. Once the run method is called, then it will call the runners. So how many times runners will execute in the project? Only one time. That means once the boot application is started, if you want to execute any logic, that you can execute by using runner. Once the boot application is started, if you want to execute any logic on your own, only one time, then you can create your own runner. Those runners will be called by Spring Boot start class run method. So once the runners are executed, finally it is returning the context. What is the context here? Context is nothing but the IOC container which is created by the run method. That is the return type of our run method. So what is the return type of the run method? The return type of the run method is configurable application context. So which class it is used to create this context? That it depends upon type of the application. Okay. So here, how run method works internally. Spring Boot start class main method will call Spring application.run method. Spring application run method is entry point for boot application execution. This run method will return reference of IOC. If Spring application class is predefined and it will identify what type of application we have created based on dependencies added in the pom.xml. Okay, the application type is used to identify to start the IOC container. Okay, guys. Now, so Spring application run method, print banner printing logic. Run method will print the banner. Run method will print a banner on the console. So that is Spring logo. That is a Spring logo. So we can turn off the banner. We can turn off the banner by writing the properties that we will discuss later. Okay. Run method will print banner on the console. Run method will start IOC container. Run method will start IOC container. Run method will start IOC container. And the next one is run method will call runners. Run method will call runners. Run method will return context of IOC. Run method will return context of IOC container. Are you guys getting my point? Are you guys getting my point? So who is doing the more work in the boot application, guys? Who is doing more work in the boot application? Run method. Okay. So now, what is the return type of the run method? What is the return type of the run method? The run method is returning the reference of the IOC container. Run method is returning the reference of the IOC container. So how it is starting the IOC container? Is it starting the IOC container blindly, or it is starting the IOC container based on the dependencies we have added? Is it starting the IOC container blindly, or it is starting the IOC container based on the dependencies we have added? Guys, it is starting the IOC container blindly, or it is starting the IOC container based on the dependencies we have added? Come on. Based on the dependencies we have added. Who is identifying what type of application we have created? Who is identifying what type of application we have created? Come on, guys. Pom.xml. Based on the pom.xml dependencies, it is identifying what type of application we have created. Based on the type of the application, it is starting the IOC container. Run method will print banner on the console. So whatever the banner we are seeing on the console, that will be printed by our run method. Spring logo. Whatever the Spring logo we are able to see on the console, that Spring logo is called as a banner. And run method will start IOC container. We understood how IOC container is starting by the run method. Run method will call runners. So what is a runner? Runner is used to execute any code only one time when the boot application got started. Run method will return context of IOC container. So whatever the IOC container is created by run method, it is returning that. So the return type of the run method is configurable application context. The return type of the IOC container is configurable application context. Are you clear with my point? Are you guys clear with my point? What is the return type of the run method? The return type of the run method is configurable application context. Okay, guys. Are you good with this? Are you good with this? Perfect. Now, what is a banner in the Spring Boot? Okay, so let's understand what is a banner in Spring Boot. What is a banner in Spring Boot? When we start the boot application, Spring logo will be printed on the console. That logo is called as banner. Okay guys, see here. When I'm running my boot application, you can see one logo is printing on the console. That logo is called as banner. That logo is called as banner. Okay. When we run boot application, it will print Spring logo on the console. That Spring logo on the console, that is called as banner in Spring Boot. Are you clear with my point? When we run boot application, it will print logo on the console, that is called as banner in Spring Boot. When we run the boot application, it will print Spring logo on the console, that is called as banner in Spring Boot. So Spring Boot banner will have 3 modes. We can set Spring Boot banner. Spring Boot banner is having 3 modes. One is off mode. That means it is not going to print anything. Second one is log mode. And the third one is console mode. Third one is console mode. It is default mode. When you don't set any mode for the Spring Boot, by default it will take it as a console mode, and that banner will be printed on the console. So we can set the mode for the banner using below property. We can set banner mode. We can set banner mode using below property in application.properties file. In application.properties file. We can set the banner mode using below property. So what is that property? If you go to application.properties, spring.main.banner mode is equal to off. Okay. By writing this property, we can set mode for the banner. If I set the mode as off, that means that banner will not be printed on the console. By default, the mode of the banner is console. It will print on the console. Suppose if I set the mode as log, you see what are the modes available? After writing this property in the properties file, when I do control space, it is giving me 3 options. So one is console mode, second one is log mode, third one is off mode. There are 3 modes available for the banner in the Spring Boot. So what is the default mode? Console. That means banner will print on the console. Whether you set the mode as console or if you don't set the mode as console, it will print banner on the console only. It will print banner on the console only. When you do the logging, if your project is having a logging, then the banner will be printed on the log file. Currently, my log is happening on the console. The messages are printing on the console, log messages. That's why banner also printing on the console. Suppose if I set the banner mode as off, that means the banner will not be printed. I'm setting the banner mode is equal to off. That means my banner is not, sorry, let me save this file. Spring main.banner mode is equal to off. Refresh. Run as boot application. When I run this application, 1 minute, I think I need to update it. Spring.main.this, spring.application properties, banner mode, spring.main.banner mode is equal to not console. I will set the mode is equal to off. When I set the banner mode is equal to off, what is the behavior of the project? So Maven update the project. Course update. I'm updating this Maven project. All right. Now let's run this project. Run as boot application. Now see here, banner is printing on the console or banner is not printing on the console. Guys, banner printing on the console or not printing on the console? Not printing on the console because of the mode is off. Okay. We can customize the banner text also. We can customize banner text in Spring Boot application. We can customize banner text in Spring Boot application. We can customize banner text in Spring Boot application. How to customize the banner text in the Spring Boot application? Go to the resources folder. In the resources folder, we are going to create a file, banner.txt. Banner.txt file I have created. Now I will write some ASCII characters here, guys. How to write the ASCII characters? You can go to internet and you can generate the ASCII generator. ASCII generator. I want to generate the ASCII text. Go to this ASCII generator. You can type something. I'm typing it as Ashok IT. So here my ASCII text is generated. So let me copy this ASCII text, guys. Whatever the ASCII text is available, I'm keeping the ASCII text in my banner.txt. Now, instead of Spring logo, Ashok IT logo will be printed on the console. Now I have updated my logo. I have updated my banner in the Spring Boot. So right click, Maven, update the project, force update. Maven, force update. Right click, run as boot application. 1 minute. Mode is off now. Remove this mode. Remove that mode. Now I have created a file called banner.txt. So refresh, right click, run as boot application. Now, can you see which one is printing on the banner? Is it printing Spring logo as a banner? Is it printing Ashok IT in the banner? Most of the people will customize their banners like this in the project. So they will keep their project name or they will keep their company name as a banner text. So do you know how to customize the banner in the Spring Boot? You just create a file, banner.txt. We can customize banner.txt in the Spring Boot application by creating banner.txt file. By creating banner.txt file in src main resources folder. You can generate some ASCII text from here. URL to generate the ASCII text. URL to generate ASCII text. Okay, guys. Like this, you can generate the ASCII text from this URL. So you can keep your name also, and you can use your name as a ASCII text, and you can generate that as a banner. That as a banner. From this URL, you can generate the ASCII text, and from that you can keep as your ASCII text value. Are you guys clear with my point? Yeah. This URL you can use to generate the ASCII text, and you can customize your banner in the Spring Boot. So now, do you understand what is the run method? What is the start class in the Spring Boot? So just to see this, Spring Boot start class is just 2 lines of code, but lot of depth is there. Without having this understanding, without having this knowledge on the start class, you cannot understand the boot application's functionality. Lot of things are executing internally. Lot of things are happening internally when we go for this Spring application.run method. Are you guys clear with my point? Are you guys able to understand? What is the start class in the Spring Boot? What is this annotation? What is this run method? What is that banner? Are you clear with all this stuff? Guys, interesting or boring? Interesting or boring? Interesting to understand all these details, huh? How many of you are aware of these details? How start class will execute in the Spring Boot like this? First time? Okay, good. Maja aaya. First time. Most of the people first time. Good, good. So when you understand the internals of the subject, then you will like that subject and you will get more confidence to answer the questions in the interview. Now, if anybody asks you what is the Spring Boot? Now, if anybody asks you what is a Spring Boot, you can tell a lot of things. Spring Boot is one approach to develop Spring-based applications. The main advantages of the Spring Boot: less configuration, no XML configurations, form starters available, form starters to simplify Maven configuration, to simplify dependencies configuration, auto configuration to provide ready-made features, embedded servers to deploy our web applications directly, actuators, production-ready features are available to monitor and manage our application. Boot first version came in the year of 2014. The current version of the Boot is 3.x, which released in the November 2022. Java 17 is mandatory to work with the Boot 3.x version. Boot application creation. We can create the Boot application in two ways. One is by using initializer website. Another one is by using starter project. If you create by using starter also, internally it will talk to initializer website. So internet connection is mandatory to create the Boot application. When we create the Boot application, this is the folder structure it will create. Okay. Now, so Boot application folder structure will be available like this. When we create the Boot application, by default, start class will be created. That start class is the entry point for Boot application execution. And one properties file will be created by default to configure any messages which are required for our application. Maven dependencies, form.xml will contain the Maven dependencies. Boot start class. So Boot start class is the entry point for Boot application execution. Spring Boot application annotation is available. That annotation is equal to below three annotations: Boot configuration, enable auto configuration, and component scanning. Boot start class will act as a configuration class because of Boot configuration annotation. Boot application auto configuration feature is enabled. Component scanning is enabled. Component scanning is used to identify the Spring Bean classes which are available in the project. Based on the base package, it is going to scan the other packages. And what is Spring application run method? Spring Boot start class main method will call the run method. Run method is entry point for Boot application execution. Run method will return the reference of IOC container. So it is a predefined class, Spring application. It will identify the type of the application based on the dependencies added in the form.xml. So for starter, it will identify as standalone. This class will be used. For starter web, identify as web application. This class will be used to start IOC. WebFlux, identify as a reactive application. It will use this class to start IOC. And along with that, run method will print banner on the console. Run method will start IOC container. Run method will call the runners. Run method will return the context of IOC container. So the return type of the run method is configurable application context. That is the return type of IOC container. Using that IOC container, we can access our bean objects also. Run method is going to return the context. That is a configurable application context. That is the reference of the IOC container. So what is banner in the Spring Boot? When we run the Boot application, Spring logo, it will print a Spring logo on the console. That is called as banner in the Spring Boot. Spring Boot banner is having three modes: off mode, log mode, console mode. Console mode is the default mode. If you don't set any mode, then by default console mode will be printed. So we can set banner mode using below property main.banner mode off. That means banner will not be printed. Okay, we can customize the banner text in the Spring Boot application by creating banner.txt file. So here you can generate the ASCII text. That ASCII text you can keep in the banner.txt. Then when you run your application, that banner will be printed on the console. That banner will be printed on the console. Are you guys clear? Are you guys clear with my point? Now, do you understand how Boot application is working? What is the role of the start class in the Spring Boot? Now, guys, tell me, calling the start class, calling the run method from the start class is mandatory or it is optional? Calling the run method is mandatory or calling the run method is optional in the start class? Calling that run method is optional or calling that run method is mandatory? Come on, guys. Calling the run method is mandatory or calling the run method is optional? It is mandatory. It is mandatory. All good? Fine. And guys, I need one help from you. So if you like our classes, could you please share your review? So I have given the review link for you. Could you please share your feedback about our classes, how classes are happening? So just to spend 1 minute of time for me and what you feel about our classes, could you please write in your words? So it will help us to improve our services also. Anybody having any questions for today's session?
Yeah,
you
can
can
you explain about that runner, sir? I do not get that runner.
Yeah. Runner topic I will explain in the tomorrow session, sir. Runners basically use it to execute the code only one time. Tomorrow you will get the clarity of the runner and I will tell the real-time scenario also for the runner.
Sir, can you explain the qualifier annotation where you have to use the exact scenario?
Sir, qualifier annotation, when you have multiple beans based on the name of the bean, if you want to inject the dependent, then you will go for qualifier annotation.
But if they have explained some real-time scenario. Actually, today I faced this entry, this question. Actually.
Yeah, sure, sir. I will cover that scenario also. Okay.
Sir, this component scan, can I keep to other Java class like instead of main method class?
You can keep in the configuration class, yeah.
Component scan will be considered as a Spring Bean class?
Yes, it will consider.
But if I keep this component scan for other Java class other than main method Java class, and that class is not executing, means that the object is not creating by the IOC container.
Only component scan, if you give, it will not consider. First of all, to give that component scan annotation for any bean class, that class should be a Spring Bean first. Then only it will consider that.
But if we give component scan, it will be Spring Bean, right?
No, component scan will not make your class as a Spring Bean. Either component annotation, service annotation, repository annotation will make your class as a Spring Bean. Component scan is just to identify the Spring Beans. It will not represent your class as a Spring Bean.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Right.
Sir, what is listener?
Sir, listener is nothing but when the application is getting started, so it will execute based on some events. It will execute same based on some events. When my application is started, start the IOC container. When the application is started, start the web server to run our web application. Load the data from the properties file. Those things are happening internally, right? So those things are happening because of the listeners giving the information to the boot. So application started, load the environments, application started, then start the IOC container, application started, then perform the component scan. All the activities are happening in the Spring Boot because of those listeners.
Okay, sir, thank you.
Sir, by default, Spring Boot is coming with Apache Tomcat 9.0.7. Suppose if we want to change it to some other Tomcat version, Tomcat 10 or something, how can we make the change?
The version that you can't change here because it is taking the Spring Boot version because of what I can say, based on the boot version we are using, right? Whenever we add the boot, create the boot project, based on the version of the Spring Boot, it will identify which Tomcat version is compatible with the Spring Boot. You can override that version also. In the WebMVC, I will show you that part.
Okay.
Hello, sir. How to resolve the how we can resolve the unwanted error in the Spring application? Like I am getting in a form.xml in the front of first line unwanted error. So how we can resolve that?
Just you can delete that error, sir. You can just delete that error, no problem. Because that error is not because of the Spring Boot. That error is because of that form.xml XSD files are not loading. Because of that, it is giving that error. You can delete it. You can ignore. There is nothing to resolve that.
Okay, sure. Thank you.
Yeah.
What
So, sir,
Spring.factory got contained?
Sorry, sir.
Spring.factory, what it did?
It contains some listener classes which are required to start our Spring Boot.
Okay,
Hello.
sir.
Hi,
Yeah.
hi, hi, Ashok sir.
Hello.
Can you configure Jetty server? Okay.
We can configure that, sir. That we will discuss in the WebMVC. By default, when you add the web starter, right, Tomcat is coming as default. When you don't want the Tomcat, you can exclude the Tomcat and you can configure Jetty as a default server.
Sorry, Jetty as a default server.
We can add that. We can add that in the WebMVC module. You will understand that.
Okay. And another question is, what is the purpose of resource annotations in Spring Boot?
Resource property source or resource annotation?
Resource annotations.
Resource annotation. I will cover that concept, sir.
Okay, and also one more. Okay, in Spring Boot, okay, there is only one annotation. So, Spring Boot application annotation. Is there any annotations rather than Spring Boot applications? Okay,
Yeah, there are some other annotations also which will come in the coming classes. So currently, so if you have any questions related to start class, that we will discuss today.
Okay.
Whatever the questions that you are asking, right, which we have not covered yet, we'll cover them in the future.
Okay, this application class .class file is there, right? Can I modify that file and can I run that?
Which one?
This one, Spring application .class. Inside the .run method is running, right? Inside that class.
How can, simple example, how can you modify, man? That is a predefined class, right? Which will come with the Spring jar file, Spring Boot jar files. How can you modify that?
In future, if I want any CA kind of thing for my IOC, so
no,
it is.
You don't modify that. No, we can't do that.
Okay. Sir, one more.
That is a predefined class. That is a predefined class.
Yeah, that I know predefined. But if in case any requirement is there, I thought we can change. So it is predefined. We can't touch.
No.
Sir, one more is Maven or Gradle. In industry, which one they will use mostly?
Sir, some old projects are using Maven, sir. From long back, Maven is available. From last 3-4 years onwards, people are using Gradle.
Okay, because Maven is different, Gradle is different. In their form XML, we need to modify. Here it is different, right, sir? Gradle. So
yeah, recent projects, the latest projects people are using for Gradle. Some old projects, 6-7 years back projects, they used Maven.
So Gradle is important, sir.
Yes, important.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi, Ashok.
Yeah, hi, sir.
What is the website you use to generate the ASCII values for the Spring banner?
I gave in the notes. I will upload the notes in that portal, sir. You can access that URL.
Okay.
Hello, sir.
Yeah, hello.
What is the difference between application.properties and application.yml file?
Yeah, I have not explained that yet, sir. I will explain that. Okay. Yeah. So I'm also preparing a video on the properties file and YML file. I think by this week I will upload in the YouTube and I will cover that in our class also.
Okay, thank you.
Right.
Sir, for customizing the banner, should we use banner.txt file only, or can we give some other txt, sir, instead of banner.txt?
By default, it will take the name as banner.txt. We will give that name. If you change that name, right, you need to configure that name in the properties file again, whatever the file name you are using. Banner.txt, that is the default file name. It will load that file automatically.
Okay, so if banner.txt is not present, only then the Spring banner will be displayed. Otherwise, it will banner.txt will override the default.
If banner.txt file is available, it will override that. If the banner.txt file is not available, then priority will go to default banner, which will print as a Spring on the console.
Sir, if you use the customized banner property file, so in the property file, what value we have to configure, like key and value?
Spring.banner.file name.
Okay, spring.banner.file name equal to that
Sir.
file name, right?
Yeah,
Sir,
which file you are using, that file name you can configure there.
Sir,
Okay.
our environment object contains system properties. What exactly system properties is?
We'll discuss that, sir. So tomorrow we are going to start the runners, right? Then I will explain that.
Okay.
Sir, an application.java, will it be created by default, sir?
Yes, whenever we create the boot application, by default application.java class is getting created, right? That start class by default will be created. And the class name can be anything. It's no need to be only application. Class name you can change also, but it is creating by default when the boot application is created.
Okay, sir.
So today you have started DevOps with AWS batch, right?
Correct.
So some requirement is coming Java AWS. So what is the exactly Java AWS?
Java
plus
AWS means, yeah, you need to have some knowledge on the AWS cloud platform also. Then you can keep Java with AWS. You can attend the AWS classes for that.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hello.
Sir, can you provide me the old recorded video, because I about to get the project in the company. So
please talk to admin team, sir. Send me a mail to admin team. They will respond to you.
okay, sir.
Okay.
Ashok sir, that Java AWS that class is going, will that be helpful for the certification of AWS?
That will helpful for the cloud practitioner certification for you. As a AWS cloud practitioner, you can do that.
Okay, understood. Thank you.
All right.
Can you please share the
Hello.
notes, sir?
Gradle notes?
Yes, sir. Gradle notes.
Yeah, sure, sir. I will upload in the portal. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, sir.
Today's class notes I have uploaded in the portal, guys. You can download that.
Yeah, sure.
Hello.
Yes, sir.
सर आपका जावा रियल टाइम प्रोजेक्ट बैच कब से स्टार्ट होने वाला है?
ये मंथ एंड को स्टार्ट होता है सर, मैं बताता हूँ.
ओके
ठीक है ना?
यस.
Hello sir. If you want one day recorded session, then we have to pay, or we will get free video?
No sir. So sending one day video is difficult for us. If you go for plan 2, then only will get the videos.
Yeah, okay, sir. I missed one day video only. That's why I'm asking.
Okay. Fine, guys. Good. Thank you. I hope all of you completed your review. If you have not completed, please do that, guys. So just spend 1 minute of time. Write your feedback. It will help me to improve my services. Please do that. It's my request. And so with this, we are done for today. And we'll meet again in the tomorrow session. Tomorrow, we are going to talk about Spring Boot runners. What is runner in the Spring Boot? How to work with runners? What is the use of runners? All right. Thank you, guys. Tata. Good night. Bye-bye.